Well, I woke up to go get me a cold pop, but then I thought somebody was barbecuing. I said, oh Lord Jesus, it's a fire. Then I ran out, I didn't grab no shoes or nothing, Jesus. I ran for my life. And then the smoke got me. I got bronchitis. Ain't nobody got time for that.
I now see what that was all leading up to. Thank you, Alex.
No worries, no worries. I thought if anyone's gonna appreciate that intro, it's Richard.
I thought it was going to be some like Wu-Tang throwback from the Massive Knicks comeback today.
Oh, right. I stopped watching.
My
Basketball after the Lakers, so I just
my set of people are less into the sport and more into the believing that Wu-Tang can make a basketball team win. But anyway,
Wu-Tang can make anything happen, you know. Yes. So today we're gonna try a bit of a new format. So we'll first do a rundown of the news or some of the news items that we thought are interesting for us for this week. And of course, we're going to play a bit with this format going forward. So please let us know what you like, what you don't like, you know, what works. And remember, you can always ask us questions in the comments on the live stream on X. So please go there and vent your frustrations or you know, or on Red Square. Yeah. And apparently Richard is plugged in there as well. So yeah, let's get going. Let's start with the news, and we have this new segment called the EU Watch, and it's basically the flavor of the week for what the EU is doing in terms of digital rights and all that malarkey. The topic of the day was basically Apple deciding not to release Siri, the new version of Siri that they announced a few years ago, not to release it in the EU because there were some claims from the EU that what the Apple was doing was not interoperable, which is correct. But at the same time, you're kind of nerfing the phones of millions of users. I mean, you're already nerfing them with the other stuff that we're going to talk about later, and now this is the new nerf. So it's kind of like the noose is getting tighter and tighter around the neck of the end user. And I'm just curious, you know, because on the one hand, this is like a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, I can understand the EU because they are correct in their assessment. And, you know, interoperability is like kryptonite for Apple. So how do we read this?
I mean, this is really interesting because I think it raises a key topic for me, which is like, what is the role of a regulator in the space? And like as a battle-hardened, gray-bearded open source dude, like I was right there being very happy when the EU, amongst other jurisdictions, stepped in and said things like, no, you can't, Microsoft, you can't embed your browser in the operating system and exclude all the others. And so I see a real space for that kind of intercession with like and place regulators, particularly around things like antitrust, etc., in places where you can't fix it by fixing the model in the first place, right? So the best thing to be doing would be to set up an environment where there's enough competition that Apple just cop it in the teeth for making something that's not interoperable, etc. And I think we can get to a world like that at some point. If we aren't in a place like that, then I kind of get into this, like you say, it's a kind of double-edged sword. I'm not sure if we should swing it or when, because there isn't any reason you can't make this stuff interoperable. Like, there's no reason that Apple couldn't make Siri a piece of the operating system with inputs and outputs that somebody else could build an alternative for, and that you could use a third-party replacement if you wanted to, even if it's pretty deeply embedded into what goes on in the operating system. That's exactly what Apple don't want to do, because then they'd be telling you a little bit about what they believe is their secret sauce, and they'd be giving anybody else making a phone instructions on how to make it work the same as what they do. I mean, I think in this case they're smoking their own product a bit, because that's one thing they totally fail at, really. Their implementations on AI. Siri has always been second run to even just using Google with voice like 10 years ago on any other, or even on an iPhone. So yeah, it's a really weird one.
Apparently, this new version of Siri is powered by Google, so we're still there.
That's kind of even more mind-blowing for someone who's coming at it from me with these guys were the ones who were at each other's throats once upon a time. But yeah, so I think it's sort of interesting. But what I think it does do is, because what we can see in this is the heritage of the regulatory wins and where they've seen regulation being popular. And then, little things like the USB-C thing as well, like forcing Apple onto USB-C in Europe feels like a win just because like we showed them, right? And I think what we do see is that then leads over into some hubris and some overreach in other places where they feel like, well, people love us regulating, so we're now going to regulate all sorts of things where like maybe it's just not appropriate.
I also think there's another question there, and it's the fact that when a company becomes so big, like Apple certainly has become, right? They can generate such large of amounts of revenue from having some proprietary dongle, right? Like the lightning cable for Apple was like hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue from cables and licenses and so on. So when they get really big, it's kind of hurting their bottom line to play nice. And then again, that kind of makes it so that you shouldn't let them get really big, right? And it's kind of like you're trying to put the genie back in the bottle, but is this 100-pound, 1,000-pound gorilla
Yeah.
genie?
Well, and I think the other thing is that like what we're seeing is a lot of this stuff is coming in way too late. And this is a kind of general thing we talk about a lot, is like my general take on stuff like, you got porn and then you got stuff where it's getting dangerous or where it's getting, totally illegal, like if there's minors involved or whatever, right? And my general take is use the law as it stands. If someone's getting hurt, right, then prosecute on that. If someone's getting exploited, prosecute on that, right? But what we see is this kind of desire to move into like banning the thing itself in general. And I think for a bunch of reasons. One is this general desire to regulate. And of course, the then ensuing kind of, sea of regulators and bureaucracy that come with that, which is always a win for a bureaucracy to invent more of itself. But then also some of it is because they're coming late to the game. So we don't have laws that fit, because, theft was defined when it was about stealing bread, in a village. And now there's like, various ways of doing it with electronic means, etc. But what's happened in a lot of places, like we've advanced our idea of fraud or whatever to include digital things. But for some reason, when it comes to certain things, people say, oh, we need a different kind of, like we need a new set of regulation. We'll regulate it differently rather than going back to the source and say, well, what is the criminal thing? And it reminds me a bit of drugs, right? Where, everything else is regulated on the consequences, but drugs are regulated on the fact that they exist, right? Like we don't prosecute a drug dealer because they hurt someone. We prosecute them because they sold drugs, just because they're drugs. And that's, I think we're starting to see regulation where it's like, oh, we want to regulate this because we should regulate this sphere, rather than looking at it and say, well, what's happening and what should we regulate?
Right. So you're basically, if I'm interpreting this correctly, you're basically asking the EU to be reasonable and have perspective.
Well, I think to look at the thing with the bulk of the laws that we have is that they're at least tested and that they've at least iterated on the realities of life, right? And the problem with this and so that's why I think if you can, it's better to extend the well thought through, but at least battle tested stuff we have to say, well, okay, how does the fraud law, how does the criminal law deal with this new concept, rather than by saying we need internet law, right? Which is, do we? Or is it actually, we don't have law for a bunch of like printing. We have rules about the results.
Well, you're gonna love this one. Apparently, Financial Times reports that parents have forced Keir Starmer, that's the British Prime Minister, into approving a social media ban for under 16s. Keir Starmer sees the Australia ban as a success, and reports say that 90% of parents that responded to the consultation were in favor of a ban. And now I'm thinking, as a European, after helping us with energy costs, world peace, economic
Yeah.
growth, do you agree that it's about time that the government should start helping us become better parents?
I mean, I've got so many memes waiting to happen here. There's been an issue, like the Labor Party in government in Australia have introduced changes to the tax legislation, and they've, irrespective of what you think about the changes, they introduced them terribly. And there's been this meme campaign of like the Prime Minister suddenly becoming a partner in everyone's business. And so it's like a yoga studio and the Prime Minister's like running it or whatever. And I was imagining, like, I'm waiting for the meme of like, because Carney in Canada came out and said something the same, I think roughly the same today as well. So an image of like Carney, Starmer, and Albanese reading bedtime stories to the children of Canada, Europe, and Australia. Because, like now that they're here to help, we don't need to read our children bedtime stories or teach them anything, because fortunately, the Prime Minister's looking after them. I think there's that side of it, but I'm also just totally reminded of, there's a Yes Minister skit. If people don't know Yes Minister, it was a beautiful, scathing slam on British politics and the intersection with the civil service. And there's a great scene where Sir Humphrey, the head of the civil service, is pointing out how polls can be manipulated to the Prime Minister, and it's about national service. And one version is, he says, kids today have no goals, and kids today need structure in their lives. And then the last question is, should we have national service? And the Prime Minister, well, yes. And then he does it again, and he says, should we teach young men to kill? Should we have national service? Well, no, right? And so I just see it as one of those things where people, like, if you went up to a bunch of parents out there and you said, should your kid's personal data be in an easily hacked database so that can be sold on the dark web? No. Should your neurodivergent kid be cut off from their friends on the internet and restricted in their ability to access a community of their peers? Well, no. But that's not what's being asked. What's being asked is, would you like to give up responsibility for having to deal with the really hard job of keeping your kids safe online? And people are, well, yeah. Right? And so, yeah, I think that's that response. What that response shows me is that there hasn't been a counter campaign. And so what that also tells me is, I think, particularly in Australia, where I saw this much more closely, the internet companies were happy with what was happening, and the government was walking around saying, we've given the big, Silicon Valley guys a bloody nose. Look what we did. And all the internet companies were like, great, because they weren't asked to do anything. They weren't asked to seriously actually act. They weren't asked to participate in actually helping people with the difficult job of actually parenting their kids. And so they were happy to watch it go through. And there wasn't really a negative campaign. And that's hence the ability for the FT to pull out some number, about 90% of parents or whatever, is being happy about it. It's because there was no serious campaign around saying, have you thought about the negative consequences? Despite the fact that if you read the actual documents that were submitted to, I know in Australia's case, the e-safety commissioner's office, when they asked for submissions, a bunch of educators wrote in and said, this is a terrible idea. There's a bunch of kids who'll be actively hurt by this social media ban. We want you to think about this. That was just totally steamrolled over. And I think that happened just because there was no serious campaign around another voice coming up around it.
Right. Yeah. It feels like When it comes to responsibilities,
Ain't nobody got time for that.
I need
that's
some
my.
buttons.
We want the buttons, huh?
Well, no, I my own buttons. Right?
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. It's just it's this coordinated move to just get people. I mean, this is literally, we've spoken about this many times before. It's just a funnel for getting the digital ID on the internet, basically, right? You do it for the kids,
Yeah.
and then you just push it onto the adults. Let's move on. Apparently, we had a little crash last week due to an exploit. Zcash crashed for a bit due to an exploit that was apparently discovered by Anthropic's unreleased model Mythos, or that's at
Mythos.
least what people are saying.
The LLM that's too dangerous to release.
Exactly, that's the one. That's the marketing line right
Yeah.
there. The vulnerability has been patched, but the question remains, and this is an interesting question: are AI agents a foundational tool or a threat to builders?
It's really interesting because I think, bear with me for a second. Talking to a friend who used to work in the diamond industry, and diamonds just totally crashed in value with the advent of artificial diamonds. And everyone's just like, oh, it's over. And what's happening now is because that happened, diamond mining became unprofitable. So no one's mining new diamonds. So large natural diamonds are now starting to actually regain value, and they're becoming scarce, right? And it's actually always been true that small, tiny diamonds were worthless, and we put them in abrasives and stuff, right? So all that's happened in the end is the size of diamonds that are worthless has gone up a bit. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. It's the way to understand it. There's going to be there's this nasty period where like bugs that were visible through AI probing didn't used to be, because we didn't have AI probing. Now we do. And so we're finding the ones that exist. But after a while, we will have AI probing as part of CI/CD pipelines, and it will add a bit of cost to doing things. But libraries and systems will have this kind of testing built in. And so we'll just move up a level. And in fact, in the end, we'll move to a level of higher security, right? So I feel like in the end, security ends up being a factor of how much effort people feel like they have to put in, and having bots out there, machines out there, toolkits out there that can find that little gap, stick their little, shim in there and start opening up the crack and then break in, will actually help people, because they'll take security much more seriously, right? So it's a worry for everyone who runs software where security matters at the moment, because, like people can bring to bear a huge amount of analytic capacity that we didn't have before, that works in a certain way to find a certain family of bugs. And that's the other thing we don't understand yet, is like, what's the family of bugs that things like Mythos can find, right? And there'll be other kinds of bugs that it's no better or worse than humans at, and those bugs will continue on and be found in the old ways until we have new analytic techniques that can maybe attack that. So basically, I think in the end, it's actually a good thing, but it'll take a while for it to pan out that way for everybody, if you know what I mean. So like, it'll take a while for like there's sort of a flight up in the detection, and then we'll catch up. And while this is happening, there's a bit of a hole, and Zcash got the worst of it because there's no evidence anyone ever exploited this, because the bot found it, but there's no evidence that it was visible to anybody else. So they found it, and patched it actually quickly. But of course, massive hole in Zcash got a lot of news. So yeah, I think they are unlucky that they were the guys who happened to be the ones under the microscope about that, because I think it's happening more than we know. And a lot of people are just sort of quietly putting in some some patches to stuff because they found a big hole, and they're just very grateful that they found it first themselves.
I see it in a different way. I see it also in terms of, how should I put it? I also see it in terms of mirroring what's happening on the market, on the, let's say, on the stock exchange. You get a bad report or like some news thing comes out and everybody dumps the stock, which is, fear always generates some people who just want to get out, right? Because you don't know how big the hole is, really. So, in a way, it also kind of brings us back to this idea: why are all crypto projects more or less focused on DeFi, right? Because if you'd have a stock that is something else, let's say communications or file transfer, then obviously it wouldn't pump as much because people are thinking in terms of, right, it's money. But at the same time, it wouldn't crash as hard because, people wouldn't be like, I have all my money in there.
Yeah. No, I mean, also Zcash particularly, because it's private, right? So if someone invented a bunch of Zcash, you can't show where they should or shouldn't have gotten it from, right? There's no history there. It's private. So that is a real problem for them. But I think you're right. It raises a particular question around the way that all of these things work, in that they have zero other utility, right? So if there's a crash in a bunch of commodities, well, you've still got something that's useful, right? Like the thing still does something, which is why commodities don't move as much as stocks, et cetera, because you're closer to the actual value that you're basing things on. And so DeFi is at the extreme end of that, where go to zero is a real possibility, because it's entirely possible that thing loses all value. And it's why it's a problem for people trying to do anything else with blockchains, that blockchain is crypto is DeFi, and that's the public conception of it.
Yeah, and I think this kind of segues very, very nicely into the last topic that we're going to be covering in the news section. And this is like an older news item that got a bit more attention now that it's been being picked up by Forbes, and that it's being also published by Cloudflare. So the other day, for the first time in the internet's history, it has been reported that machines now generate more web traffic than people. The quote that stuck out the most was, companies that continue operating under the assumption that users are human risk misreading their own system. For any investors, this is a potential repricing event across every category that monetizes human attention. Now, as an Open Internet Pod member, how should we read into this?
Well, I mean, my first thing is open internet. Do what you want with the internet. That's what it's there for, right? My second thing is I'm imagining a cantankerous old monk shortly after the invention of the printing press saying, do you realize that recently more words have been created by machines than written by hand? Like, it's a nonsense thing, and it's really annoying, because there's a very real and interesting concept of dead internet theory, right? Which is the question of, like, who's making what content for who, right? And that's a super interesting thing to get into, because that's about, like, advertisers creating whole virtual worlds just to convince people of a slight version of reality that sells their products better. Interesting. What the bots on the internet are doing, like, whether people have this funny thing where they're like worried that people are not Google searching, that they're using AI chatbots. I'm like, a Google search doesn't involve rolling up your sleeves and getting into the archives and fiddling through files, right? And looking up index cards and going and finding the book and reading it. A Google search is essentially AI, right? In a very different way. It was a very, very simple cut down AI that did one thing. It found something for you, right? And it was useful very early. There's no real difference. If I have an agent booking my flight tickets, is that better or worse for the internet than me bumbling around 15 different travel websites trying to get $10 off my ticket, right? I think that's just an uninteresting take on what's going on, right? Because it's just, like, I'm sure there were people in the bulletin board days saying, "What, 50% of web traffic is now browsers." Like people aren't reading anymore, right? They're just looking at pictures of the internet. And I'm not sure that's so interesting. Like there's a small thing. Okay, we're changing how we use the internet and what machines we ask to do what to get our access to it. What's super interesting to me is the question of how much slop is there out there, and also how much human generated content, but it's machine amplified to form particular corporate ends or whatever, whether it's advertising or propaganda, et cetera, and how much is there out there which is an actual genuinely human attempt at creativity or sharing or that sort of thing. And that to me is the much more interesting question. Now you could do that in a bunch of ways, right? Like if I'm blind and I'm reading Substack with a reader, right? That's technically an AI. Like, is that bad? No, it's good. I'm on there reading content, right? It's more to do with the fact of like what percentage of stuff is out there, which is an article someone wrote for the cause of like getting the content of it to people because they care about it, versus is it regurgitated stuff, or is it cleverly crafted just to manage opinion or to pump sales? And that to me is the really interesting question.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, and for me it always comes back to this idea where the cost of using the internet, comes down to zero. You incentivize this sort of mechanics, right? There's literally nothing stopping you. It's like all spam mail costs zero.
Yeah.
Then guess what? You're gonna get a lot of spam mail.
Right.
So
yeah. Well, it's where the system is set up to. There's a disconnect between the friction and the cost of doing things and the provision of the platform, what you're actually doing. So you have things like social media platform where the social media company provides the platform essentially for free because they've got a separate sideline business model. And you as soon as you do that, you're starting to have this disconnection on the incentives. And so if you're just letting people spout stuff for free, there's no friction, and actually it's easier to replace them with bots or whatever that do the same thing. And it's because there's no there's no alignment there. And I think that's a really key thing. Like the costs need to happen where they matter.
Great. I think we covered these topics in great detail. So now you know what's happening on the internet. But speaking of the internet, this is and especially this topic from Cloudflare, I think is a great segue into part 2 of our discussion on Web2 versus Web3. Today's episode is called The Wall of Bland. And last week we spoke about the difficulties that a user encounters when using Web2. And the Forbes article is, icing on the cake in that regard. But we also recommend you to listen to last week's episode in case you missed that one, because there's a lot of stuff there about the user side. Today, we're gonna look at the client side. And I think that, it's a very, how should I put it? Because when you think of the client side of the server side, right? When you think of that side, you don't really, how do you make it so that it makes sense? Like what are the strengths and weaknesses of Web2 and Web3 on the client side? There is no server on the Web3, right? Or it shouldn't be, at least if it's real.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of those things where it's an organic story. It's not a story of design, right? So I think the way we ended up with the Web2 that we ended up with was, and people aren't necessarily aware of like what the 1 and 2 is all about. Like the kind of concept is that 1 was posters, right? You can put something up on the internet and it's static and it just exists there. So that could even be a blog, maybe, but it's generally you have to handcraft web pages, and then they just sit there, right? And you can go and read them. 2 was supposed to be interactive, so you have things that become platforms, and you can post on them, and then people can respond, and you get interaction, etc. And that wasn't it's not like there was like one and then the other. Blogging slowly introduced things like comments, etc., and then comments became most of what was there. You know, they didn't have to start with an article. You could just have a thread, and then eventually you just ended up with the feed. And so we had a kind of smooth transition in terms of the tech and stuff. There's not like there was this weird day in 2011 where Web 1 broke and Web 2 turned up or something. So it's a bunch of technologies. The idea behind Web3 is that instead of just becoming read-write, it's also the ownership. People can own their part of the internet. And it's actually, I think, in some ways where this 1, 2, 3 breaks down a little bit, because if you look at it, what you've actually got is, yeah, read-write's cool, right? Like, why should I, as someone who knows how to spin up a server and write a web page, have access to publishing my content on the web when you don't, right? So making that much easier to do, that's good. It's nice. What we saw is that it moved away from that original vision of, okay, let everyone read and write, to a situation where we have gatekeeping, we have mega platforms that have agendas, and it's either a political or more likely a commercial agenda, and so things have devolved from social web, where that read write was people reading and writing to each other, to where it's mostly a one-way feed of dopamine tweaking content that's engineered to keep people attending to the platform, right? So that's not an essential feature of technically what people call Web 2, but it's where that got us, right? And so I think that's why it's seen as problematic. And I think that process is inevitable, unfortunately, not with a read-write internet per se, but with the internet we have and the technologies that we use to make that read-write possible. It's centralized around a few big providers. And there were all sorts of issues where we didn't have, like with email we mentioned before, at least it's an open protocol. Anyone can work on it. And we went to closed systems. So, Twitter started with this API. You could read and write from Twitter without the Twitter software. And they slowly closed that down because they wanted platform control. It was the only way to make money out of Twitter. And so I think that's really the issue, is the way the internet works and its lack of certain features led to the way to monetize it and the way to make it profitable to provide those services being what we ended up with, right? Enclosure, value extraction through side channels or other methods, lock in, all of those things that we know and dislike from kind of modern Web 2. But it's not like people set out to do that, and it wasn't like, Web 2 was glorious in its conception and people were so happy, and it was coined as a positive term to sort of say, look, this is much more egalitarian and democratic and anyone can have their say and da-da-da-da. So in terms of the advantages of Web 2, there were many, but the disadvantage isn't that you can do those things. The disadvantage is that the incentives for providing the opportunity to do that, i.e. the platforms you're going to end up with, have a bunch of problems, and it's because that's what they're incentivized to do. It's in the incentive structure creates that in the end.
Yeah, I get it. It's I remember Web 2 was amazing in the beginning. And it's one of those things, I guess it goes back to this incentivization idea where, you help the users and everybody's happy. Then you monetize the user to help your business clients, and then the business clients are happy. Then you monetize both the user and the business clients so that you can make more money. And I think that now we are kind of approaching the end of that cycle, because the last step is you die. And I think that that's where we are now. We're in this process where people are waking up and understanding that, as long as they can screw that screw tighter, that's what's going to happen. No one's going to pull out and say like, oh, you know what, my bad, we went too far. No, it's just the incentives are not there for that sort of behavior. So I'm wondering, like, could it be said that the Web2 model is a corporate model, or it has become a corporate model, or somehow in order to be built, it had to be a corporate model? That is to say, a version of the internet that is run by businesses, while the Web3 model with the read, write, own is more about an internet of the people, a network of peers, as I like to say it.
Well, again, I'm going to be me and dig in a bit.
Go for it, dig.
But I think it's important here, because like that's how Web3 was sort of read, write, own. But I would say that there's a specific difference that's really important that actually distinguishes Web 2 from what I would see as Web 3. And that's because of what I just said, right? So this CorpoNet scenario happens, I think, because that's the only thing that's incentivized. It's the only thing that has a way of making money. So if you look at the alternatives, right, you've got things like, we'll use WordPress as an example, right? So there was WordPress, you could get the software, you could put it on a server, a cheap server, and you could put up your blog. Or whatever kind of website, actually. And there's still a huge number of websites that are just WordPress. Or you could use WordPress.com if you didn't know how to do that. But in either way, you're still paying some kind of subscription fee or hosting fee, et cetera, to do it. And so you have to be able to make money out of it to keep it going. So if you look at it now, the vast majority of WordPress sites out there are for a local shop or quite a big organization. There's a few, record labels or whatever, they'll just use WordPress, right? That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's the only, like, they're not doing it because they want to share something with the world. People who just want to share something with the world use the Substack or something like that, which is, again, on a platform. And that's because Substack now can provide that free tier because they're monetizing what's underneath it. And so I think it's actually not really the own part that makes Web3. It's the ability to have business models that don't involve current type corporate structures, that don't require those corporations to be profitable by enclosing the system, by extracting value, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, this is where we get into some really interesting territory where, it's not just about being peer-to-peer. That's a key factor in it. And parts of Web3 are just like that, right? Where, I'm not arguing you shouldn't just have the ability to stand something up, et cetera, and do it because you want to, and you can subsidize that. But if we want to look at huge platforms that give vast numbers of people the ability to interact with each other, then to make that possible, you need some kind of revenue stream. Because if it's 150 million people sharing cat videos, that's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to run. And so you need some kind of significant business model or income stream to cover it. And I think that's actually where we fall down for the most part, is how do you do it in a way that doesn't force you into a corporate model or leave you relying on tiny volunteer networks that don't really expand as much as we'd like?
I have an idea here, and it's just a thought that came up as I was listening to your argument, because I agree with you, and I feel, or I think that it's more of a situation where you have make it versus make it big, and Web 2 is more of the make it big model, and on Web 3 is maybe more of the make it model. Like, for example, Maybe you're just serving a niche community, or maybe you're doing something that is local in your neighborhood. And you can do it on that scale because guess what? The infrastructure is built into the network, right? You don't need to buy the servers. It's like opening a bakery. You can open the bakery, but you buy the flour. You don't need to go and plant the seeds, grow the crops, harvest the
Yeah.
crops, grind them, make the flour, and then, right? So I think this idea of how you approach Web3 versus Web2 is
Yeah.
maybe the problem, because you still have the Web2 mentality. Or am I wrong in this?
Well, I think that's really important, right? Because I think there's a lot to it, and the way to think about it is things like is often through analogy, like with musicians and making money playing music, right? There's an assumption now that you have to make it big, right? That the reason to get into music is to be an almightily wealthy rock star who throws televisions out of windows or some kind of cliched thing. But there's been a world in which musicians were either farmers who played in the pub when it got dark in winter, or were jobbing musicians. They got paid for playing music. Like, I want to hear music. I will go somewhere where there is music. I will either buy beer and the publican will therefore pay the band, or I'll go and pay to see it. Right. And there's a kind of, that's obviously sustainable, etc. In the sense that, I mean, you're assuming everywhere has pubs, right? If you have to bring your own pub, this is not going to happen, right? If the musicians need to like create their own pub just to have the concert. And so I think it's really a question of looking at what's success and what is the objective, and then what stops that from being captured in the way that we've been talking about, because it's very easy to stick on corporatized, but there's also just regulated or controlled in ways that prevent people from being able to participate openly. But I think the wall of bland theme today works really well, because I think that's obviously the great example is if you have a space where only the industry that provides you the media would prefer there's only 12 giant acts, that's what they're gonna push, right? And so there's an active interest in promoting only a few big players, rather than trying to have a real diversity of things that, like, at the who's playing down the street at the pub level of diversity. And so I think these things are really deeply intertwined that way.
No, I agree. And this idea of the wall of bland, I'm thinking, if you just look at your infinite feed on Instagram Reels, or on YouTube Shorts, or on TikTok, even here on X, most of it is just bland. It's just some sort of mini event that has some sort of drama, or something unexpected happens. But eventually, everything is the same. It's literally some variation of a behavior, whether that behavior is antisocial or unexpected or something along that line. It kind of becomes this wall of bland. So if anyone needs help with the doom scrolling, stopping that behavior, just imagine you're just watching paint dry, because that's pretty much where I think you're going to end up if you just keep going this way. Or am I
No, I mean,
too
it's
pessimistic?
no, I think I mean, I've had a few people talk to me about this, and like and they just say that, like, and it's funny because someone said this to me the other day, and it reminded me of when I gave up smoking. And the impetus to me was when I realized I was being really cautious about booking long flights. And if you're an Australian, that's most flights, around airports or opportunities to smoke. Right. I was like overly conscious, and I realized I was willing to pay like a stupid amount of extra money. So I got to go to an airport with a smoking lounge in between. Right. And it wasn't so much the money or anything. I just really something I feel like someone's bitch here. Like, you just end up feeling controlled, right? And I think that's what, like, I've heard that being said recently as a reason people have given for giving up the doom scroll, whether it's like quitting Instagram or whatever, is that they realize they feel like they're being controlled, like a cigarette addiction will control you. You know, it'll alter your behavior in a way to get you to do more of it. And I think that's a real sign of just how far it's gone.
Exactly. And it's exactly that point where the company is using both the businesses and the users at the same time, and it's crashing, right? So I think that more and more people are beginning to notice, that Web2 is not really the internet, but instead this group of non-interoperable networks, right? These different fiefdoms or platforms, as they call them. I call it the CorpoNet because I think that's much more accurate. But let's say you're a business, like a real business, and you want to build on Web3. And we kind of touched upon this in the earlier answer. But what are the incentives? Because with Web2, even though it's dying, the incentives are quite clear. Or is it one of those things where the incentives kind of, come up as you explore, or because we never knew Web2 was going to become this either, right? It was something that was a process.
Well, no, I think for me, the thing is, it's quite different, and it's very hard to get out of the mind space that we have now, because we've got that moonshot Silicon Valley mega money model of success. And I think there's a bunch of ways that things are different, right? I think providing basic services like data storage and routing and stuff in Web3 will be attractive because almost like you've commoditized and tokenized them, right? So you have this ability where people can come in and provide into the system agnostically, and they don't have to win users. They don't have to come up with reasons. They can just, if people need more compute, they can bring it and they can profit. So you can have very dull tech companies that just come in, like phone networks and stuff. They can just come in, see need, build equipment, service people, and make money out of that, right? Because the base layer needs to be paid for. And then you have a really vibrant ecosystem on top of that, where the real gain is that you can have so many of the walls to entry, the barriers to entry are removed, so that you can have successful businesses at much lower scales and much more locally, etc. So part of what I really like is, if you just look at where ad revenue goes on the internet now, right? A tiny sliver, it's gotten well under 1%, goes to all of the infrastructure and everything going on, right? So the original argument was, we put ads on, I run a medieval role-playing community website, and to pay for it, I get the local costume shop to put up a banner ad, right? This is like the web in 1993 or 7 or something, right? And they pay me $50 a month to advertise to my users, and that pays for me to run the server, right? That is so far from what happens now, where the actual revenue from clicks, etc., the percentage of that goes on running the servers is almost nothing, right? The percentage of it that is actually worn in any kind of cost or any value to the user is therefore almost nothing, right? Like, so theoretically, the reason I'm getting advertised to on any given website is to pay for the website, but my attention was worth $1, and I spent half a cent or less, right? Or half a cent or less of my attention went on that. The rest of it bled out to people I'm not really fussed about, right? And that's the ad network and the content provider, and most of it goes to the ad network, right? So that's to me the greatest way to understand the opportunity out there is, actually things should be about 80 times more profitable than they are to creators and so forth who are living off ad revenue. Between 80 and 90 times more profitable, right? And if that were true, right, then you can see, like, in a space where that is true, you can see that that allows for people to start building up an audience and being profitable in that audience at far smaller numbers than we think of now. Right. And so we have versions of that are now gone again. So, the old school ad read in the podcast, right, was a short-lived throwout to that kind of world. But now the pod networks have ad insertion tech where we're back where we were, right? And the ad content is worth far more, but the creators are getting less and less and less and less of that. So to me, one of the ways we smash through that wall of bland is by having systems where wherever the revenue is, whether it's a Patreon style, punters out there putting their money behind, I'm interested in this thing, or it's ad driven, or there's another form of revenue there, affiliate links. There's a bunch of different ways of doing it where that is quickly enough to make the content creation worthwhile, etc. And we get, in fact, funny way, we go back to something where like even a small village sustained a few musicians and actors, right, to keep them entertained. Because actually, if you look at how much people are willing to spend on those things, it's non-trivial, and you don't have to have a lot of them for it to be profitable for someone else. And so we go back to a thing where there are as many creators and interesting people to interact with in your local area as there are, say, restaurants or something like that. So it's not like they're profitable in some crazy way. They're just profitable like doing that, which creates so much more vibrancy, because some of it will be local geographically, but some of it will be local on very different metrics like tastes and interests, etc. And so you'll be able to have a much more diverse, much more interesting space than the kind
I
of.
had a I had a I had a question because you said like 89 times more profitable, and I'm thinking, can we think of an example of something that can be 80, 90 times more profitable? And that, does that mean like I'm going to build it on Sado? If that's the case, if if I can do that, then why not?
Right. So, I mean, it's a simple thing. If you can get, if you look at it, and I looked into this once to write something about it, but if you look at what, say, like Mercedes will pay for a qualified candidate to sit through a 5-minute video ad about their cars, it's like $50 or $60, right? The thing is, right now, the way that's thrown at you is intersposed in some video you were trying to watch about how to make a frittata on YouTube or something like that, right? You weren't just given that option. So I see a future where Web3 has a lot of advertising, but it's opt-in. You have like ad stores, so you can choose how you interact with advertising. It's an agreement between you and the advertiser. And the time to do that is in interacting with some kind of content, and then you split that with the creator, right? So it might be 50-50, it might be some other ratio, but I get my browsing for free basically, and they get money out of it. And you wouldn't have to have a lot of people, like not by YouTube follower number type lots of people, before people sitting through that ad was actually paying like a decent amount. And I think, we're starting to see a world in which like the bigger podcasts and stuff are becoming very, very profitable. I mean, Rogan got 100 million for his or something, but I think there's a big swathe in the middle where you've got some smallish podcast companies now that are middling profitable, and with access to the ability for them to get, very high grade, high value, thought through advertising to their users, where if it's a tech podcast, then people selling into the tech community will pay a lot to get to that audience. If it's done in an opt-in way where you can say, well, I could pay for Alex's tech podcast, or I could watch the ad at the start, I've got the option. But if I watch that ad, I actually see that I myself get enough tokens to be able to browse for a few days. And I know Alex gets what I would have paid him on Patreon for the month. That's a pretty decent deal. I'm not worried about that. And I think it's just building out that infrastructure of ad networks moving across and having that kind of objective Right now, there's no way they'd want to do that because they're trying to keep the market cornered, etc. But it's ripe for disruption, and I think done in a way that's genuinely peer-to-peer, where everyone is of equal standing in that mix. And that's the difference, right? Right now, if you set up a little website, you can't walk into the front doors at Google and demand a deal. You get
Right.
the thing they give you, which is, whatever. If they're getting 10 cents per click, you're getting 0.001.
Right. So what I'm hearing here is that the infrastructure and the architecture itself is built in such a way that each and every user kind of has terms and conditions of their own when reaching out to each other, and they have leverage, which is always something we talk about in this podcast. Something like Zero is one of the only projects that gives users leverage. Like, you can come with your own terms and conditions, because guess what? People cannot push you into accepting their terms and conditions because they don't have automatic access to you, right? It's not like you can always sidestep them, right?
Right. Well,
You're not
that's
being forced to continue
that's
with Google.
that's the biggest thing there, and it's one of the reasons to understand the problems around having to use digital IDs that are forced on you and not under your control, right? The power comes from the fact that I'm using the identity I chose to use here and now, but I can put on another one, right? So I can't be held ransom or pushed around. I'm a peer with the other organization. I take it or leave it with I want. It doesn't mean I can demand something that's not profitable to them or doesn't make any sense, but they're in the same position and their competitors are in the same position, right? So you end up with a fair level market where I can get my service from wherever I want. If someone wants me to pay $400 an episode for their podcast, that's what they want, and I can choose to do it or not. I can't make them do anything, but they don't have a way of cornering that, and that being one of my only choices, right? I can always go somewhere else, and someone else who's got interesting content may charge something. I'm prepared to pay for it, and that's always open, right? So that's why those things that we bang on about at Saito are really important. Things like openness, so that anyone can participate as the viewer or as the creator, as the user or the creator. Those are both open. Participation isn't gated in any way. And then also the ability to, to pay for things directly rather than having to have these separated business models. So having the infrastructure just be there and paid for by its use, separate from the business model, et cetera, those entirely different businesses. That's really important, because that can create these level markets where it's genuinely me turning up every time, able to negotiate my case fresh, and and everybody who's providing being under equal pressure from competitors to stand out and do something for me that matters.
This has been the Open Internet Pod, powered by the Sato Network. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Alex.